Good afternoon, everyone. Let me introduce myself. I am Gianluca Gennarelli. I am part of the InfoCert marketing department. My colleagues and me are very pleased to welcome you all there to this webinar session focused on the disruptive power of eIDAS. Before leaving the space to our guest, I would like to give you a simple technical instruction to better manage our time together. Please, if you would like to ask questions, write them during the webinar time in the specific space of the toolbox on the right side of your desktop. We will collect them and we will try to provide an answer at the end of the speeches. Possible questions could be further detailed via email after the webinar. It's time to start. With a great pleasure, I introduce the moderator of the webinar, Mr. John Shama, IMA Chairman. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this InfoCert sponsored webinar on the disruptive power of eIDAS. I must say we have an amazing audience today. We have more than 30 countries represented and attendees from both private and public sectors across many of the most important industries. As most of you will know, eIDAS, the new EU Trusted Services Regulation, is now in force. As a regulation, and unlike a directive, it is enacted in law in each of the EU member states. It's one of the few top-down actions at the EU, and it reinforces a single market and digital society by ensuring that there is cross-border interoperability for trust services and identity across the entire 28 EU member states. And this is really no small achievement. It has taken many years, and at its helm during this time has been Mr. Andreas Servida, the head of business unit of e-government and trust at the EU. We're honored to have Mr. Servida today, who will present this afternoon and explain some of the features of the trust services encompassed by eIDAS. He will explain how they are managed in each member state, how they are key to EU initiatives, and importantly, how they benefit the citizen and business. And that's really an important feature of eIDAS, because like all good laws, it is focused on outcomes rather than technologies. So the role of qualified, trusted service providers like InfoCert is critical to interpret and deliver those outcomes. After Mr. Servida, we'll then move to a business analysis from Forrester. Craig Lecaire is joining us from the US and will describe and explain their analysis of how disruptive digital and trusted re-engineering of business processes can enable savings, efficiencies, and improved customer experience. In this instance, Craig will describe business analysis carried out by Forrester. Finally, Carmina Alute, the Chief Information Officer of InfoCert, will describe the trusted role of qualified trusted service providers such as InfoCert and the practicality of business process reengineering through eIDAS compliant digitization. Each presentation will last about 20 minutes, which allow us to have time at the end to address questions that you will have sent in as requested via the platform. So the first thing I would like to do is to introduce Mr. Andreas Servida. Sorry, that's me. Sorry, Mr. Andreas Servida. And you can see his bio here. He's joined the Commission in 1993. He's now Deputy Head of he's now Deputy Head of Business Unit for e-Government and Trust, and he co-manages the unit. He's worked for a long time in the DG, and I will hand you over to Mr. Servida now. Thank you. Andrea.
Good afternoon. Thank you, John. Good afternoon to everybody. It is really my pleasure to be here today and address you with this little presentation by which I will shed some light on what is indeed the eIDAS, why is it important, what do we see the value, where do we see the value of this regulation and why it is so critical for the accomplishment of the vision of developing a digital single market in Europe. Next slides, please. eIDAS is a regulation, is about mutual recognition of electronic identification means and trust services. But the very ambitions of the regulation is indeed to boost, to put in place a framework that would stimulate the provisioning and the reliance on electronic identification services and trust services for the purpose of boosting trust and supporting businesses over the digital. And in order to do this, of course, I mean, we had to overcome difficulties that we had experienced since, I would say, the first legislative initiative that we had in the domain, which goes back to 1999, when the directive on electronic signature was adopted at the European level. And the key problem that we had faced and we have been confronted there was the problem of not having the cross-border use and reliance on the trust services regulated at that moment in time, which was essentially the electronic signature, to really be working as it should be in a digital environment which is by construction borderless, is seamless, and even more importantly, is, I would say, making it possible for users, would it be natural person, legal person, to be able to interact and transact over the network in an environment which needed to be, I would say, trustworthy and to be secure in order to make the transaction to be enforceable. And this is why the four keywords that were part of the motto of the eIDAS regulation are indeed trust, convenience, cross-border, and seamless. And when I say trust, it means going beyond what is just the security properties of a transaction, but is the, I would say, associated to inspiring confidence that what is being transacted and what is being relied upon is not only secure and reliable, but also is enforceable in relation to what might be the legal value which is associated to those services we are relying upon. Would it be the identification of a person, or the electronic signature, or the electronic registered delivery service, or the timestamp of something? And it should be convenient, which means it should not be, I would say, difficult to get these services to be operated and to be delivering the trustworthy, I would say, assertion, which is important to associate to the transaction or the access that we would like to carry out in the digital, which is by definition cross-border. And the issues there is not very much on the technological aspect, it's very much on the legal aspect. What is indeed going to be the legal value of something that is being created in on the basis of services provided in a certain jurisdiction, while the transaction is being perhaps concluded in a different jurisdiction. And all these should be seamless. It should work in an environment where we do support the access and the reliance of those services, disregarding whether we're using our iPad, we are using our desktop, we are using a portable device, or we are using a smartphone. I think the seamless experience and the seamless, I would say, trustworthy experience is indeed one of the key aspects which characterized the approach which was taken in defining the principles and the rules in the regulation. Next slides, please. What is eIDAS about? As I said, it's about mutual recognition of electronic identification means, with the caveat that the recognition will be associated to legal value of what is indeed going to be recognized cross-border. And even more importantly is, because that is indeed, I would say, the main subject of the presentation today, is the legal framework to ensure the provision, or to, I would say, stimulate and to govern the provisioning of electronic trust services in a way that any party in Europe, in the 28 member states, will be able not only to rely upon services which are provided in conformity with the eIDAS regulation, but even more importantly, for anybody in Europe to be able to provide their services from anywhere in Europe with the legal value that is indeed associated to those services being enforceable and valid everywhere else, which means a company A or a trust service provider would, under the eIDAS regulation, be fully entitled to provide the service being established in one of the 28 member states and having the services being, I would say, available and being relied upon in every other member states in Europe. But of course, I mean, what I think is also important not to overlook is that, the eIDAS regulation also provides the non-discriminatory rules for the cross-border recognition of electronic documents that, believe it or not, is for the first time ever addressed and regulated at the European level. Next slide, please. What is indeed where we stand? We stand at the point that indeed the eIDAS regulation is fully operational and is applicable for what concerns the trust services as of the 1st of July 2016, whereas for the second part of the regulation on electronic identification means the full application of the rules will be as of the 29th of September 2018. So this year will be another milestone for the eIDAS regulation. Next time, please. Next slides, please. Why is indeed a regulation? Is a regulation because, as it had been alluded to, in the past we had, I would say, a legal framework which was very much linked, was very much provided by a directive, which gave origin to nearly compatible legal service, a legal regime in the existing member states, but it couldn't serve the purpose of really making the market, the single market, to work in relation to not only providing those services across boundaries, but even more importantly, for any party to be able to rely on services which may be acquired or, I would say, received from other countries. So this is why the eIDAS approach, which came into force or was adopted in 2014, so it means 15 years after the adoption of the directive on electronic signature, not only expanded the, I would say, scope of the services being regulated, but it provided a legal framework which is enacted as law as such in all the member states. So what is valid or ruled in the article of the regulation applies everywhere in the 28 member states. In order to do so, of course, I mean, for the trust services, we had to make sure that indeed the approach will be consistent with, first, the fact that the regulation should be technological neutral, so to let the innovation to kick in and to provide new services, but even more importantly, to ensure that the services will be defined with respect to what is indeed being regulated and the rules that would make the provisioning and the reliance on those such services to be transparently enforceable everywhere in Europe. And this is why the approach is less normative than perhaps, I would say, it might have been liked by certain party, and is based on, I would say, establishing a series of principles which lead to, I would say, a risk management approach by which such rules are instantiated in terms of operational conduct and procedure under the full responsibility of the providers of the services and the supervisory authority which are associated to them. And of course, I mean, to do so, however, the eIDAS regulation does empower the Commission to adopt a number, for a number of articles, listed of references to technical standards which are not mandatory, but the adoption of which will give the presumption of compliance with the regulation. Last but not least, For trust services, there is no obligation to use such services for the private sector. This is free, I would say, for the private sector to decide. It's a free decision for the private sector to decide how or whether to use them. But certainly, the reliance of on these services and the products that the services do deliver is associated with legal value, which is extremely important to bear in mind. Next slides, please. What are the general principles? Of course, I mean, to build trust on services, you need to have clear rules, transparency and accountability rules. And of course, I mean, all this is based on very clear liability regimes. And there is where the InfoCert regulation distinguish between the regime for what are considered not to be qualified services, for which there is non-discriminatory provisions which apply, which means that court cannot deny admissibility in legal proceedings just on the basis that services are of electronic nature, vis-a-vis what is indeed going to be qualified, of higher level of trustworthiness and assurance, for which there are much stricter, I would say, rules that applies, and for which, of course, I would say the liability regime is a bit more demanding, and this is where the reversal of the burden of proof applies indeed only for qualified trust service provider. Why this? Because qualified services do carry the presumption of equivalence to the equivalent, to the similar services in the physical world. Next, please. Again, in this respect, what is indeed very much established is a framework by which the distinction between non-qualified services and qualified services is not only made crystal clear in the regulation, but is also very much associated with much stricter rules and stricter compliance requirements that will apply to qualified trust services and qualified trust service provider. Why? Because indeed of the legal value. If I'm relying on a qualified electronic signature, the qualified electronic signature is carrying the presumption of equivalence to handwritten signature, which means that the court cannot reject the qualified electronic signature as fully equivalent to handwritten signature. The negligence of the author of the signature may be, I would say, challenge, but not the qualified electronic signature as such. In order to do so, there are specific requirements, and there are conformity assessment tests, conformity that have to be passed in order to be awarded the qualified status. Next, please. And once you are, next slides, please. And when you are indeed awarded, can you go back to the previous one, please? And when you are awarded the qualified trust service qualified status as a trust service provider for the services which are recognized qualified, you are made visible in what is the trusted list, which is an enforcement list. It's not an information list as it used to be under the service directive, it's an enforcement list. If you are not listed as a qualified trust service provider in that list, you are not qualified. Who put you there is the supervisory authority who has the duty to complete the accreditation procedure upfront before the qualified services are being provided. And in order to make your service, your qualified service to be visible to the public, then you are free to decide to associate to your services the trust mark that you see there, for which the respective, I would say, implementation provision are in the referenced article of the decision that you see there. Next, please. Why it is all this important? This is important because under the InfoCert regulation, qualified trust service provider, which is granted this qualified status in a country, they are qualified everywhere in the EU. Qualified trust services, which are issued by qualified trust service provider in a country, are recognized, this is a legal obligation, are recognized as qualified trust services everywhere in Europe. This comes from the internal market principle, and for what concern in relation to the services, for what concern the result of the outcomes of a service, so the electronic signature, the electronic sales, and the timestamp, we have specific rules or specific, I would say, provision that do state in the regulation that a qualified electronic signature is qualified electronic signature in all the member states. The same for electronic seals. A qualified electronic seals is a qualified electronic seals in all the member states, and the same is for qualified timestamps. And these qualified electronic signature, reseals, and timestamp, they are associated to enforceable legal value that is the same in all the member states. Of course, if we think of, for instance, the electronic signature being the handwritten signature of a different nature across the different member states, what a qualified electronic signature will establish the equivalence to handwritten signature in all the member states. What is the value of a handwritten signature in each member state is a national competence. All these aspects have been thoroughly presented in the question and answer that I referred there in my slides, and I invite you very much to look at this, because this will give you a bit of a flavor of what is indeed that we support in terms of understanding of the application of the article. Of course, I mean, the only body that is entitled to give an enforceable interpretation to the articles is, of course, the Court of Justice. Next slides, please. For the electronic identification, we are still, is still, I would say, work in progress. But here again, it goes in the direction of ensuring the mutual recognition and the obligation for public administration in member states to recognize to accept and recognize electronic identification means which are notified according to the eIDAS regulation. And all this is based on a set of principles that are the most important one are the reciprocity in relation to, I would say, defined level of assurance, which means if in a country the level of assurance of the electronic identification means which are recognized at the national level is of a certain level, low, there should not be any additional requirement for electronic identification means which are notified with the same level of assurance under the eIDAS regulation. And even more importantly, is the mandatory recognition, cross-border recognition to access public services. And this is important because to some extent, it's like for the passport. There is no obligation unless we enter into certain regulated environment for private sector to accept passport as an identity document. They can rely on whatever. Certainly between member states, there is an obligation to recognize valid, genuine passport, which are as such assimilated to travel documents. And the same goes for, I would say, electronic identification means. Why this is important? Can you please go to the previous one? Previous, okay. Why this is important? This is important because member states retain their sovereign responsibility to decide what is indeed to be accepted and recognized at the national level, and what is to be notified to the other member states and the Commission as the means that they can be used for cross-border engagement across the different member states. Next, please. Why this is important? It is important because it has, together with the trust services, the possibility to dematerialize a number of processes that goes from the management of, I would say, health records in the health sector to the payment, where we have seen that in the regulatory technical standards, a reference to qualified website authentication certificate is established, and even more importantly, in the context of anti-money laundering, on the 20th of December, the Council and the Parliament agreed on the compromise text of the Anti-Money Laundering Directive number 5, which gives full recognition to electronic identification and related trust services for the purpose of carrying legal value for identification and proofing of identity of prospective customer. Next, please. This is where we stand indeed with the electronic identification. We are putting this to work in order to make it possible for legal compliance against very demanding regulation like the anti-money laundering to fully happen cross-border and in a complete enforceable way. And this is where indeed I would say we are assisting, because the legal framework is the directive, the member states, the regulators, and the parties in defining what would be the operational guidance that could associate the operationalization of the use of electronic identification means for KYC, fully digital KYC, which is a precondition for portability of KYC in the fully digital environment, without having the obligation to show up at the branch of a company. So Andrea Servida, being Italian, living in Belgium, will be able, with notified electronic identification card or level high, to open a bank account in Sweden or in Germany or in Spain without having the need to go to Spain, Sweden, or Germany. Next, please. This is, I would say, all very good, but if we don't get the member states to notify their means, we will fall short of the means that can be used. The good news is that Germany has already completed the notification, so it's the first member state that has fully that has completed the notification procedure. The second one is the pipeline is Italy, and what is interesting for the Italian pre-notification is that whereas the German one was based on the electronic identification means, so the full equivalent to the electronic identity card, that is the full equivalent to the identity card in the physical world. For Italy, what has been notified is the private sector electronic identification scheme called SPID, which would indeed, that is the first private sector schemes that is notified under eIDAS. We are waiting, we're looking to more pre-notification, and between now and the end of February, we expect 2 further member states and 2 other member states to notify in March. Next slide. This is where you find all the relevant information, and of course, I mean my numbers, so that if there is any problem that you or later thought that you may have, you can always reach me by email. Thank you very much for your attention.
Right. Whoops, sorry. I'll just move that back once. Yes. I'd like to now thank you very much, Andrea. That's really interesting, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. Can I ask people to write them into the message box on the right-hand side of the screen, and then we'll ask all the questions at the end. I'd now like to introduce Craig Leclerc. Craig is works for Forrester. He's vice president and principal analyst at Forrester Research, and internationally recognized, helping companies transform. I'll leave it directly to Craig.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Andre, for that really good summary.
On to the first slide.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Yeah, so let's move to the first slide. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and address this group. I operate at the intersection, really, of the legal framework and the technology. So I'm going to be talking more about how companies are moving towards a digital business and where digital signature, electronic signature, and the legal framework really fits into that. Can you advance by slide, please? As you probably can tell from my lack of accent, is I'm from the U.S. and I like to think that I have a broad view of electronic signature across both the U.S. and EMEA and in APAC. So that's what I attempt to do anyway. So it's a pleasure for me to join something like this where I can get immersed in the legal frameworks that are really ahead of the rest of the world in terms of what's going on in EMEA. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we'll just get right to the the sort of setup slide for all of this, and this was touched on by Andrea, that you've got to have a convenience with whatever legal framework is levied upon the trust requirements for conducting business, electronically. So we like to refer to this as the age of the customer that we're in, and really transitioning, right around the time of 2008. We were all worried and immersed in the financial crisis. We didn't realize what was going on with the introduction of the iPhone, with the introduction of Facebook, and really we're just starting to take off with this social media and mobility, and really driving power to humans and individuals and customers in a way that they never had it. In a sense, the institution's ability to control their brand and their ability to dictate the customer experience was really lost as that power shifted to consumers and customers and so forth. So that's really where we are, and we have to think of electronic signature and authentication and all of these things as sort of a balance between getting the right level of authentication and security and keeping that customer experience something that millennials and Generation X's and Z's will participate in. Next slide, please. Now, this is a bit of a complicated slide, but the point is that e-signature, which you see on that upper line, is one of really an assortment of technologies that and approaches that are really trying to move companies to a digital business. It is shown there because it is emerging. The adoption level worldwide for e-signatures for substantive transactions is growing at, in Forrester's data, 50 to 60% a year for substantive transactions, not signing with a signature pad in a pharmacy or grocery store, but for contracts and so forth. And it's right there with a lot of interesting technologies, all of which are trying to get companies to move from a paper and analog process world to one where they have more of an end-to-end digital flow. And that's this notion of digital transformation. It really came out of that age of the customer conversation. It also came about because we have seen evidence of new companies that are based on digital models come in and take significant market share away from traditional companies. So there's been a digital disruption pressure on companies. So this is the set of technologies, when they look at it from their internal enterprise architecture view of the things that they're focusing on. So you see things like business process management, workflow. You see things like customer communications management or document generation, very much associated with electronic signature, and that a lot of the documents that are composed that are headed for signature, really start with drawing information from core systems and putting them in templates and creating and composing the finished document, and then that's absorbed in the electronic signature platform, and then the ceremony and the business process management related to that takes over. So all these things are related, and all are really important. I'll mention just one very interesting technology in the lower red line there, which indicates the level of immediate business transformational value to companies. So you see e-signature has a very, very high level of business value and is relatively early stages of its development. Robotic process automation, is a building bots essentially to do some of the low value tasks that companies are challenged with. It's a way to get sort of more instant digitization, if you will, by creating a bot that takes over maybe some data entry and keystrokes and other work that's being done. And that's very much related to the whole digitization pattern, but it's also involved in being able to maybe capture and aggregate information and data that will end up going into the composition engine to create the document that then ultimately gets absorbed into the e-signature platform and then ultimately signed. So all of these things are related, electronic forms and so forth. Next slide, please. Now, we do surveys. We're a research company, and that's kind of what we do for a living. And we recently did interviews with 25 e-signature production implementations, and these were worldwide, as you see on the left. The U.S. and EMEA, in total. And a couple things came out of that. One is the implementation times for putting in all of the trust framework, as well as the underlying digitization capability for e-signature was being reduced. So if you dialed back 2 years ago, these were bigger efforts, and we'll talk about the actual timelines for these. But it's basically getting faster. The customer-facing processes remain hot in the sense that we'll talk about 3 primary use cases for signature. Some are customer-facing, some are business to enterprise, meaning internal. So we'll talk about those distinctions in a minute. And of course, the adoption in electronic signature has been much higher in the U.S. to this point than in Europe. And partially it's because of the legal frameworks we're talking about today, and having them get solidified and progressed, and to get company reciprocity is just a huge barrier to adoption for a multi-country, multinational EMEA-based organization to commit to this level of project. If they couldn't be assured it was accepted cross-country, that was a barrier. So all of this we talked that Andrea set up is really, we believe, going to increase the adoption and try to get to the kind of adoption that we're seeing in the U.S. Now, next slide, please. Yeah, the other thing that's making implementations faster is that many of the solutions are SaaS-based. So that means that the sort of the templates for doing the signing ceremony, can be and the technology infrastructure for that are hosted externally, and that's becoming more acceptable to companies. And that's I would say, we take calls from companies as part of their relationship with Forrester and talk to them. And 65% of those inquiries, the buying entity company looking at deploying e-signature, we're looking for a SaaS solution. So the market has turned very much towards a software as a service approach for this, just in the last 2, 3, 4 years. Implementations, they are around 9 months for larger enterprises, 5.5 for medium, 2.3 for small business. And you often hear, the provider or the vendor community talk about much more aggressive implementation times. But when you really look at what you're doing in building a trust framework, say within a bank, you have to interact with lots of people internally. Lots of meetings. There's lots of sign-offs and check-offs internally as to whether the right controls are there for moving towards having an electronic experience and validity and auditability and governance. So a lot of this time isn't the technology; it's everything that surrounds it. But technology-wise, there are issues with browser compatibility. A lot of the data, as I talked about, is absorbed from core systems that actually form the basis of the document. There are issues with signature pads, diverse signing solutions. An organization may have 15 different business units or functional areas, and some may want different levels of authentication. Maybe a multi-factor phone-based SMS. Maybe another organization is looking at maybe biometrics, which are trending in this area. Another one might be very, simply use internal passwords and credentials that customers already have, for example, to access an ATM. So there's a lot of, issues with how to get consistency within an organization for e-signature. Next slide, please. Now, when you look at the business metrics for companies that are doing this, they've been pretty good. These are just some of the data points I pulled out of the survey we talked about. 80% error reduction. When you look at a document that has wet signatures and what happens to that in the back office, there's an acronym in the U.S. called NIGO, not in good order. Well, what does that mean? That means that the document set is opened up, looked at in the back office, and there's a signature missing. And so the ability to call a customer and get that signed back and forth with paper, or maybe PDFs that are emailed or so forth. It's just hard to get anybody on the phone these days, right? So, if you can, the electronic process is much less error prone. So a lot of the business case drivers for a lot of companies, particularly in financial services, has been reduction in errors, productivity improvements just in handling paper, opening up a bank account in 8 minutes, 22,000 hours saved annually. These are just some of the top business results. And the auditability and governance related to an electronic evidence for this is just much stronger than anything you have in the paper world. The legal community has been behind in recognition of that, but anyone who looks at it, just objectively, would have to make that conclusion. Next slide, please. Thank you. And I just wanted to show you kind of the distinctions that we're talking about in terms of the signature workflow. This is a little hard to read, but it might be good to refer to later. The point is that everything starts in the upper left with the absorption of metadata, the creation of the document generation process, the absorption of that document into the e-signature platform, and then you go through a workflow. They have to consent to sign. All of these things have been are basics of e-signature regulations and laws that really preceded eIDAS. But the point is, on the upper right, is that a lot of the features of the e-signature platform have become, frankly, commoditized over the last few years. I mean, 4 years ago, we used to do Forrester Waves, where we compared different e-signature platforms, and there were feature differences in terms of setting up the the document for signing, the form manipulation features, the number of authentication capabilities that could be used in the process, whether just the advanced signature was supported, or whether was there a true digital signature? Did the platform have the ability to meet standards for control and issuance of digital signatures? Could it absorb them from trusted service providers and so forth? These were differences between the platforms, but today they're less so, and the emphasis has shifted to exactly what we were talking about with Andrea's talk. It's shifted to authentication, and that's what you see on the upper right. So that the core features of the technology from a platform standpoint have gotten pretty similar among the platforms. It's really about how you handle authentication. That's really become the cornerstone of how you decide what to do. Next slide, please. Yeah, and if you look at it, these are the three use case areas for e-signature. We're going to take a look at one of these, case studies in just a second. But there's a lot of business to enterprise use cases. In any kind of process manufacturing, for example, you have internal quality checks that are really critical. So you have QA sign-offs. You have non-compete letters, purchase requisitions, ad hoc signings. These are all, what we call business to enterprise use cases. For business to business, this is interacting with another business. So you might have a non-disclosure agreement, as you see in the lower right there. But the bigger area, the one that is, has the most process variation, the most variation in implementation, and the area that is driving the market is really the lower portion, their business to customer B2C. And this is where mobile point of service signing is important, support of independent agents, account opening is really big, sales teams integrating maybe with a Salesforce or some other platform that might generate from a sales go lead to contract and then have to sign. These are the areas that are really driving. Now, you can probably go to the next slide. Thank you. This is an example, online banking and fraud. This is actually a study that Forrester, did on behalf of InfoCert. So, we looked at one of their big banking customers, EU-based, many physical branches, the usual kind of focus in terms of ROI for reducing internal costs, but a real focus on the customer experience. They wanted 100% digital experience. So this is, again, going back to my very first slides, was what companies are trying to do. They're trying to get to 100% digital experience. Excellent customer satisfaction, engaged with InfoCert for about 2 years, but they put in the complete trusted onboarding platform. So enabling a more complete set of technology, much like the first slide I showed with, for the whole digital channel. You can see the results down there, very strong return on investment. Again, it's very consistent with the other survey that we did for the 25 companies. These look like very similar kind of metrics that are coming out of that. So very, very strong payback. Next slide, please. Yeah, I've just said this already, and I think you get the sense of that from both Andrea's presentation, and you'll get, from the rest of this. Really, is that the emphasis is shifted towards authentication. EU has the most advanced regulation in terms of digital. The U.S. is really kind of like the Wild West. For most use cases, the advanced signature is adequate. There aren't the use, prevalence, certification of as many TSPs in the U.S. To really issue certificates and manage them externally. So it's a very different, different feel to the market. I think it's more trending the way it's being viewed in the EU. And certainly you don't have to look too far to understand that electronic identification, cybersecurity, authentication, these are going to be the distinguishing aspects of any system going forward, where the vulnerability really exists. So, we see that banks can rely on the qualified trust service providers, enterprise. I think what's really interesting in Europe is the ability of some of these TSPs, the more advanced and larger ones, that will actually transfer some of the risk. They'll take responsibility for authenticating the customer and provide that as sort of a legal responsibility, and really offset that from the bank or the financial institution. That you're not seeing that in the U.S. That's to me a very EU-centric approach, which I think is really, really good for the future. So next slide, please. I'm getting conscious of time here, so I want to be sure that we can fit it into your schedules. Mobile signing is, and I think we Andrea talked about this, is very, very important. You've got to have a strong customer experience with this. There's actually a lot of emphasis on providing real-time session management and video and so forth, all within a signing ceremony. So if you can, it gives you another form of vetting of the individual signing as well, if you have a recorded video of the of the experience. But you also can have an advisor plugged in, or another official, maybe somebody to talk through the electronic signing, so forth. So we're seeing session management become part of this overall ceremony that involves the contract discussion as well as the digital signing. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is sort of my major point in this, is that e-signature, all we're talking about is really a component of the overall management of the digital transaction. And this is sort of a progression that we see, where the focus sort of tactically on the e-signature in the document in these first two stages, but then you're going to see more and more signature as part of a component of a digital platform, and then you're going to start to talk about and look at the end-to-end business transaction, in negotiable instruments and so forth, and then you're going to look towards real future technology, which is distributed ledger, based on cryptocurrency, that is going to have an effect in this area, in that there's the use of digital certificates, there's strong validation, strong audit trails, a lot of things, particularly in the area of e-vaulting, which is a subset of e-signature, in my view, where there are lots of regulations around creating essentially a transferable financial asset. We think that blockchain will have, distributed ledger technology will have a great effect on that, and it will affect e-signature and what we're talking about here today over time. And again, it's very, very early in the market for that. Next slide, please. Yeah, and just my final point to kind of bring things together, digital transformation is really the discussion here. And how does eIDAS and electronic signature fit into that? And what organizations struggle with is, what are the platform choices that I have? I have, what we're calling digital transaction management. You see up there on the left, which is, again, a lot of the e-signature platforms have, put together a lot of technologies that can help you create that electronic transaction. But that's competing in a way with, traditional business process management and case management that organizations may have. Where do you want the orchestration of the process to be? Do you want it in a DTM environment? Do you want it in the broader BPM solution in the company? The major cloud platforms, functions specialist cloud platforms like ServiceNow and Salesforce, they're also offering stronger and stronger process layers, so that if your document composition and your meta and your core data is all involved in that domain-specific cloud, it may make sense to orchestrate that within the process capabilities of that environment. So it's really just saying that there's some enterprise architecture, there's some strategy issues and so forth, but you want to look at this DTM area as one of the alternatives for how do I digitize that end-to-end transaction. Next slide, please. So in summary, adoption is growing, and it should be a component of your digital business. There is a behavioral change, and the important technologies are here today. It's good to do a webinar where you're not talking about AI, right? There's nothing that we've talked about today, at least that I have, that is not proven, relatively mature technology that can be deployed, and people are doing it. Organizations are doing it, as shown from our survey and the case study that was reviewed. So this really just needs energy and focus and some vision. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our host. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Craig. Very interesting indeed, a very interesting business perspective. And of course, eIDAS does bring the entire 28 member states as your market, the single digital market. So you are accepting transactions from across all of Europe, which is 400 million users, which is really tremendous. So thank you very much, Craig. We'll go on to the next and final presenter, who's Carmina Oletta. And Carmina is the Chief Information Officer of InfoCert. And he is very experienced in the technologies, and in particular we'll be talking about qualified trusted service providers. So I'll hand it over to Carmina now. Carmina, it's yours.
Yes, good afternoon everybody, and I'm sorry we're going to be a little bit out of time, but this session will be recorded, so if you just have to get out now, you will be able to get it from our website later on. So let me try to summarize what we have heard so far. Andrea told us that for the first time in Europe, we have a clear, universal and comprehensive trust framework for the digital world. It is not mandatory for the private sector, but it does make sense to adopt it because it enables an effective digital transformation, as we have heard. Here, my point is that eIDAS, it's great, it's good to have it, it's necessary, but alone is not sufficient. And somehow Craig said the same. In order to enable a successful digital transformation, eIDAS is the framework to do it, but then you really need to rethink entirely your business processes, change your business behavior in order to succeed. And today I'm going to show you some of examples of how we have done it so far. Just let me give you a few numbers about us, InfoCert. We are the largest certification authority in Europe. We serve more than 2,000 customers, enterprise customers, spread out in 10 countries. And just to give you a sense of the size, we managed last year almost 100 million qualified signature transactions in just 1 year. And this number is growing at an impressive rate year after year. So we do enjoy a privileged point of view when it comes to digital trust market. Andrea spent a lot of time describing a QTSP, Qualified Trust Service Provider. That's what we are. We are one of the first players to become Qualified Trust Service Provider in Europe. And you heard still from Andrea that eIDAS enables different level of trust if you want to digitize your business. To get to the highest possible level, you need to rely on a Qualified Trust Service Provider because he will take care of part of the duty. He will be responsible for identifying the parties that want to take part in a transaction. He will assess the willingness of the party to transact. He will validate and preserve the entire transaction, guarantee the privacy, and most important of all, he will be liable for the entire process. So that's what the key that has been introduced by eIDAS. So in a nutshell, a QTSP really allows to reap the highest possible value from the regulation and to limit the liability of the companies that are adopting it. In my personal view, QTSP are not all the same. I mean, when it comes to compliance, of course, they all play on the same ground, but I see at least three levels of QTSP, so we can say. No, the basic one, number one, everyone that is a QTSP standard is there. You need to have a deep understanding of the framework and how to apply the principle of the framework. I'm not saying that it's not okay to be in this level. I'm just saying that in order to be able to add additional value to your clients, you better move in the upper layers. So we move to the second one. We can call it an advanced kind of layer, where it's not enough to have a deep understanding of the eIDAS framework. In order to be effective in helping your clients in digital transforming their business, you really need to have a deep understanding of their sector-specific regulations. So pharmaceutical, banking, utilities, telco, they all are regulated sector with all specific and country-specific somehow regulations. So in order to maximize the synergies between eIDAS and those specific regulations, you really need to be an expert in all those areas. And I call this now the second level. And then, in our view, there is also a third layer. And the third layer, pretty much what adds to the second one, is that you don't look at regulatory frameworks as a burden any longer. You don't look at them as a constraint, but you see regulation as an opportunity to disrupt business processes through innovation and out-of-box thinking. So you really leverage what's coming out of the new regulation to redesign your entire digital processes. If you get to this level, you are not doing just digital transformation. You can do it a really digital evolution and become a different kind of player. And I mean, this is not just a statement for us. Innovation, leveraging regulatory framework, is actually driving InfoCert business. Just to share some numbers with you. We are a company which is growing double digits for the past 5 years. And if I look at our numbers, you can easily see that almost it's not more than 20% of our revenues, is coming from products and solutions that did not exist 2 years ago. So we are rotating very fast our entire portfolio, innovating all our solutions pretty much every 5 years. We reset the company and start selling different stuff. In order to do that, we spend 6% of our turnover on research and development. We get some funding thanks to the EU research funds, and we do some patents. We have today 14 patents only in the space of trust services. So we can say we are really an innovation-driven company. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of what, with an innovative approach with eIDAS, we've been able to do. Let's start with TOP. TOP was mentioned by Craig. TOP is a trusted onboarding platform. It's a solution that we patented back in 2013. And the idea there was to enable a customer onboarding digitally, just using a PC, a laptop, a tablet, a phone, and the webcam that all those devices have inside. It took, I mean, technically speaking, couple of months to define the solution, a little bit longer to patent the solution, and much longer now to of compliance for data protection, customer protection, and so on. But at the end, we did it. It was challenging to sell now this disruptive way of onboarding customers to the first bank. But since then, since 2013 now, we are serving more than 50 banks internationally, and we have completed on such platform more than 6 million pure digital onboardings. The best part of TOP is not all the ROI that, I mean, there is some very interesting Forrester report that you can download from our site. In my view, the most important part is the customer conversion rate, which is increased dramatically for the banks that are adopting it, because they don't have to stop their onboarding process any longer. They can start and complete in one session. And even more important, the reduction in fraud rate. Measured or independent measure done at our client premises have measured an 80% drop in fraud rate for our customers that adopted TOP. Well, since then, TOP has been evolving quite a bit. Nowadays, we offer 6 ways of enrollment, 6 ways of access an identity remotely. This is in this slide. I'm just showing you one of the last one we launched last year. It's called Self ID, and pretty much it's an identity assertion based on a chatbot. The client will have to download the app, chat with the bot on the other side. You see an example of chat here. The bot will never ask the same question twice to different customers. The customer will also be asked to go to a video selfie recording and this kind of stuff. At the end of the session, he will get a proven digital identity. Another way that we have done innovation using our onboarding platform is by expanding its adoption in the business value chain. This is just an example of what we've done, for example, in ING Bank. They had the process for lending that was pretty, let's say, old style with, sorry, I guess I lost the slide. Yes, here it is. Was a process that was paper-based. It took a lot of effort from customer point of view. You had to go to the branch, and this process lasted 13 days. So we sit down with them and worked out how to rethink from scratch the entire process. Of course, we did not just transpose the existing process to the digital world, but we start with the goal in mind. So we want to be able to complete the same transaction in 5 minutes instead of 13 days. So we start from the target, and we did it. Nowadays, if you're a customer of ING in a couple of European countries, you can do a fully digital lending request, and in less than 5 minutes, you will have the approval answer and the cash in your account. So they went from 13 days to 5 minutes, and of course, conversion rate increased quite a lot, renounce rate dropped, and this is a typical example of what I mean when you say eIDAS was definitely an enabling factor there in this case, but we have to mix it up with a complete redesign of a business behavior like it was and like it is right now. But eIDAS is, and I mean, our innovations are not just about financial services. This is another solution we came up, it's another patent actually, we came up last year. GeoSign, it looks like one of the many apps that nowadays are available on the App Store for signing, but it does something more that all the other apps can do. You can actually prove your geographic location. So this means that you can provide a multidimensional level of enforceability to whatever proof of evidence. It can be a picture, it can be a video, an audio, a document, of course. And once you sign it, you will have the identity of the signer, its willingness to sign that piece of evidence, the point in time through a timestamp that will prove when that transaction happened, and the exact point in space of when that transaction was executed. Okay, it's nice to tell the story about GeoSign because our idea behind it was to replace the paper-based car accident claim form that maybe any one of us has been able to fill somehow in their life. It's very clumsy, paper-based. So our idea was we just can replace that car accident form and with some picture that can be taken by an app, and then we can digitally assign the picture and have the proof of evidence of where the exact location where the accident happened. In this case, we will also be able to reduce a lot the number of frauds. It turns out that now we are installing the application in quite a wide variety of industries. For example, home medical assistance, when you need to prove that you visit a patient at a specific location at a specific time and you administered a medicinal drug. It can be used for this kind of use case, or it can be used also if you have to prove that a distributed infrastructure on, for example, a power grid that is subject to continuous maintenance. You can prove using the app that a specific asset was maintained at a specific time in a specific place. We also use our innovative solution in digital trust to comply with the other regulation. This is an example with the GDPR. Secure Drive is the name of a solution. This was patented back in 2010, I believe. It's one of our first patents. It allows a secure storage in the cloud of whatever content you have, which is highly sensitive data. Nowadays, you can store this data and have a mathematical proof that the data was not accessed, changed, modified, or so on. So you can get the highest possible level of privacy, complying with the provision of GDPR when he asks that some sensitive data can be accessed only by some specific people within the organization. Another interesting innovation, which was not born with the idea of GDPR, but now we are using within the to comply with GDPR, is Secure Stream. This is a patent of last year. Here, the idea behind it was that nowadays, wherever we go, can be an hotel, a train, a bank office, whatever, there are cameras all over the places that are recording all our actions. And those cameras, at the end, you get out of them a sequence of digital frames. Now, those frames are not trustworthy. They can be easily deleted, modified, and so on. So in most cases, they do not represent a strong proof of evidence. So the idea here was to just to sign each frame that is coming out of such video, and sign the frame concatenating with all the previous frames. So even change one single bit in a sequence of frame, you will embed the system. So this idea that we come up with looking at the surveillance market, now we are using it to comply again with GDPR, because the same principle applies to the data center logs. If you want to make sure that the logs that are coming out from a data center are bulletproof, are a valid proof of evidence, this will provide just that, because everything will be digitally signed and digitally approved by a trust service provider. And this is pretty much how we have leveraged eIDAS to come up with the disruptive idea to enable digital transformation. I just want to end my presentation showing you what we are doing to apply digital trust principles in some sectors that are not trustworthy by definition. Now, let's start with the blockchain. Blockchain, in theory, it's from a mathematical algorithm standpoint, it's pure perception. No, it's an algorithm that cannot be broken. It's self-enforcing. But when a blockchain algorithm has to be implemented on a computer, it becomes vulnerable. And we have a lot of reported crimes about cryptocurrency that have been sold. As a matter of fact, the reported crimes today exceed the billion US dollars. And the last one just happened last week in Japan with a fraud of almost 500 million US dollars. The question where you have to cope with this is that, on the other side, there is just an algorithm. So there is really no clear liability framework. So in order to deploy this interesting technology at a business level, you have to work out the trust chain and the clear liability framework. We are investing on this. We are a node of the Sovereign Network, which is a distributed identity network based on a distributed ledger open software, where it's not a public permissionless as it is the classical blockchain. Is a public permission. So where you have some sort of gatekeepers that validate each transaction that enters the distributed ledger. So you have a clear liability framework. That's what we're doing in the area of blockchain. Another area where we are investing, where still there is a lack of a clear regulation in terms of trust, is IoT. And as a matter of fact, IoT is much more critical than blockchain because it does an impact on the physical world. As a matter of fact, in IoT, we are building a network of objects that can feel through sensor, the physical world, analyze those data, and act on with the physical consequences in the physical world. You can think of just a car. A car nowadays is a network of smart objects that gather data, analyze the data, and act. It's pretty much impossible today to drive full speed the car against a wall because the brakes will be automatically activated. And I'm not talking about a Tesla. I'm driving a German car today. My wife is driving a Swedish car, and both those cars have the feature of automatically brakes in case of collision detection. No, the point is, what happens if an hacker gets inside the car and gets control of the steering wheel and brakes, as it has happened? What happens is that when hackers can get hold of our laptop, he can just steal our data, destroy our data. He can get in our Bitcoin wallet, he can maybe steal, destroy our wealth. But if he can get in our car, in our IoT system, whatever it is, he can actually destroy our life. So the consequences are much bigger. And in this area, unfortunately, eIDAS as it is today does not apply. So what we are doing here, we are piloting with one of the largest cities in the world, and IoT, trusted IoT ecosystem, where all the value chains are trusted, and from the power plant, power grid, till the whole smart meter, because we believe that all the principles of eIDAS, the proof of identity, the privacy concern, the liability framework, has to apply to the IoT as they do not to the human or legal transaction as we have seen before. So to summarize, as Craig said, EU today has the most advanced regulation for digital card services, and we fully agree with that. But technology moves very fast, and if we look at those use cases, I just mentioned blockchain or IoT, this translates that we should start building right now the next regulatory framework to cope with the new challenges. Thanks everybody, and I give the floor back to John.
Thank you very much indeed. I must say, very interesting with regards to the technologies that InfoCert has developed and is continuing to develop. We now have a question time. We'll move on. We're running a little bit late, but if I can, I'm sure there's been a lot of questions coming in. If we can start with the first question, and can I have that one, please? I can't see it on the screen, so I'll go manually on this. Okay, this is for Andrea Savida. Can a citizen of a member state be identified from a QTSP, a qualified trusted service provider, accredited in a different member state in accordance with the identification methods listed in the CPS and receive a qualified certificate? Can he use this certificate in his or her member state with full legal validity of the signed documents? Andrea.
Okay, so the question is indeed about the identification of people by a qualified trust service provider, which is accredited in the member states, according to the procedure that applies to that member state. Yes, I think that indeed this could be done. Of course, I mean, what I think is important is to bear in mind that, the national procedure that normally apply in the member states related to identification do apply to, I would say, citizen of the country or resident in the country. So if Andrea Servida would like to be identified in Sweden, of course, I mean, and the qualified trust service provider is a Swedish one, then of course, I mean, the procedure that would apply in Sweden to a Swedish may not necessarily be fully compatible with what Andrea Servida will be able to provide for the identification of himself, so in this case myself, because I'm an Italian citizen residing in Italy, unless everything is based on some sort of, I would say, enforceable procedure that would apply also to residing people outside of Sweden. However, if we do rely on electronic identification means under eIDAS, so if I do rely, for instance, on what are the Italian credentials SPID, once they will be notified, once they will be fully notified under the eIDAS regulation and for the level high, then Andrea Servida, Italian citizen with credentials which are enforceable in the digital everywhere, can be identified on the basis of those credentials everywhere in Europe, according to what are indeed the rules applicable or provided in the regulation. So the answer is yes, if I'm identified in full compliance with what are the procedures established in at the national level where the qualified trust service provider is indeed accredited, yes, once I'm identified according to that, I get a qualified electronic certificate that is a qualified electronic certificate that is recognized everywhere in Europe. The shortcut is that in the digital, via eID under eIDAS, I may rely just on what is indeed accredited or recognized as enforceable electronic identification means, a digital electronic identification means, which to some extent make the credential to speak for the identity of the person that is indeed willing to get a qualified certificate from the qualified trust service provider anywhere in Europe. And this does supersede what is the procedure that is indeed defined at the national level and recognized at the national level according and certified by the CPS as it is in the question.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I hope that's answered that particular question. Okay, so a second question, please. I think that will be for Andrea too. And that's, so I can't see it on my screen here, but I will go directly. And the second question is, sorry, for Craig. What are the main differences between European landscape and the rest of the world as you see it in the area of digital trust?
Well, the main difference is simply that the U.S. has really settled upon the advanced signature, with layering, multiple authentication aspects to the advanced signature, but not involving a certificate in any way. And this is, in some sense, has allowed the market to progress really, really rapidly. So when you look at authentication in the U.S., there's, knowledge-based authentication is considered pretty good. It's, either generated by, from public databases as a service. Biometrics is gaining in, importance, particularly things like voice, print, and facial. The survey I showed had some evidence of that, not as much as I think will be in the future. Phone-based SMS, two-way SMS, combined with internal credentials for a lot of applications. So, in a sense, you could say that the U.S. is tilting towards customer experience over trust, and that has allowed the market to accelerate. Now, that to me is the sort of the headline observation of the differences.
Thank you very much. I have another question for Andrea. How and where can the use of a digitally signed document, for example, a fiscal authority, verify if a trust services provider is certified to provide trust services? Andrea.
The answer is very straightforward. The information normally is associated, is first stated in the certificate that is, I would say, the trust service provider is a qualified trust service provider. But to verify that this is trustworthy information, the tool that is available is the European Trusted List, where trust service provider, accredited trust service providers, so qualified trust service providers, are listed under the responsibility of the supervisory authority, which granted the status of qualified trust service provider.
Lovely, thank you. I think that that's quite clear with regards to trust service lists and everything within the eIDAS services. Could I have the next question, please? Right. Again for Andrea, does a public authority of a member state, for example, a fiscal or administrative authority, need an explicit consent from the local supervisory body to accept a qualified certificate issued by another member state's qualified trusted service provider? Andrea.
Okay. Okay, the answer is no. If the public authority is already accepting at the national level electronic signatures for the proceedings that is being, or for the procedure that is being associated to what indeed they are receiving from another member state, then under the eIDAS regulation, the public administration is obliged to accept electronic signature which are of the same level of assurance of the one that are accepted at the national level or higher, which means that if an electronic signature is accepted at the national level, or then qualified electronic signature should be accepted even if it comes from other member states. And there is no need to ask the prior authorization by the supervisory authority. There is a legal obligation under the eIDAS regulation for the authority to act in this way.
Thank you. Yet another one for Andrea. I think they're ganging up on you. Can any member state supervisory body or parliament issue a law, a guideline, or any other measure which may affect a different member state's qualified trusted service provider only because the latter is issuing a qualified certificate in a cross-border situation?
The straight answer is no. The eIDAS regulation provides the legal regime for qualified services and provisioning of such services. So for qualified service provider to issue and to provision qualified services. At the national level, there cannot be any legal act that will supersede what is a primary law which is enforceable at the European level. Regulation will overrule. If that would be the case, it will be a clear case of, I would say, incompatibility with the eIDAS regulation, which will indeed, I would say, not be acceptable under the treaty.
Thank you, that's good. To Carmina now, how do you see the future of the qualified trusted service provider market in Europe?
Okay, I mean, nowadays, if we look at the numbers, we have more than 170 QTSP in Europe. They are all small-size QTSP mostly. And in my opinion, no, this made sense before eIDAS came into force, because each country had its own specific regulation. Nowadays, it doesn't make sense anymore. In my view, the market will consolidate soon, and at the end, there will be less, few big players that will have the size and the resources, or the capability to innovate, to ensure the highest level of compliance and the best value for their customers. I think also we have run out of time. I want to use this time to thank again all the panelists. I want to thank John for being to chair the intersession. Of course, Andrea, always enlightening. Claire, it brought us a real international view of the e-signature market. And I just want to remind that everybody that we will publish this webinar on our webpage. So all the people that are attending will receive a link now if they lost something or they want to listen to it again. It will be just easy to get. And if there are additional questions, as I think they are coming right now, we'll try with the help of Mr. Servida, a lot of questions again for him, to also provide those answers, or just redirect to the Q&A, which is already been published by the European Commission. Thanks again to all speakers. It was really a pleasure for me to join the panel.
Thank you to you and to the others, colleagues.
Yeah, and can I just also add to say thank you to all the speakers, Andrea, Craig, and Carmina, as well as to InfoCert for setting up this webinar, and also to all of you that have come along and stayed through it and given up your time to attend and listen. Thank you very much indeed.